Welcome to the Caffeine Stream on Caffeine and Philosophy.
Alright, hello everyone. This is the Caffeine Stream, the podcast of Caffeine and Philosophy. My name is Chris, aka CB Robertson, and we're here to talk about guns. And by that I mean the Second Amendment, where it comes from, the ideas behind it, what are the arguments on both sides, and so forth. Now, for full disclosure, I am very much on one side of this debate. I own several guns. I am a big fan of hunting and sport shooting, and but also holding guns for self-defense, not just as a matter of practicality, but as a matter of virtue. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. Let's start from the bottom up. I think a good place to start for most people is the legal basics of this matter, because this is essentially a matter of law. And it's worth, I think, in any conversation about this, returning to the original text, controversial as it is, of the amendment that has inspired this whole debate. So let me read the Second Amendment here real quickly for everyone. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. It's a sort of infamous sentence for its somewhat ambiguous use of commas, leading to a lot of confusion about which clauses go together and whose rights are actually being preserved here and what the nature of this right actually is. And this is not just a debate among the lay public, the legally illiterate masses. This is a matter of changed opinion even at the level of the Supreme Court. And interestingly enough, the history of Second Amendment Supreme Court precedents is actually remarkably short. There really isn't a lot to it. It basically comes down to 3 cases, which are really just 2 cases and an extension. So without further ado, and they represent a shift in Supreme Court opinion on interpretation of this. So it's not a grammatically simple right being talked about here. So we'll try to shed some light on this and go into why there's been so much confusion around this. So the first real Supreme Court case that emerged from the Second Amendment was in 1943, if I remember correctly. Let me search that real quick, actually. 1939, and that's United States versus Miller. United States versus Miller is an interesting and sort of atrocious case for a number of different reasons, not least because the plaintiff didn't show up and there was no defense. It was basically just a hearing for the prosecution, which is to say the United States, to make its case, and the Supreme Court ruled unanimously 8-0 in favor. But it set precedents, and it established in case law, essentially. I'm sure I'm misusing that technical term, but it established for the record at least one aspect of what was intended for this. The case was that Miller and one of his friends, both gangsters, by the way, were traveling somewhere in Arkansas, if I remember correctly, with, among other things, a sawed-off double-barrel shotgun. Now, in the years of Prohibition, the federal and state law enforcement agencies had established a bunch of laws that basically made new things illegal that gang members tended to do. And these were designed to give selective enforcement power to law enforcement agencies to go after gangsters. So if they couldn't get you on racketeering or on murder, they could get you on, tax evasion or carrying these guns that you're not supposed to have. And that's what happened with the first, I'm sure I'm getting this mixed up too, but NFA, the bill that was proposed during Prohibition that was originally intended to ban pistols full stop. That ended up being ruled unconstitutional. But a lot of other things that were attempted to be pushed along with that ban were passed. So this is why we have prohibitively expensive tax stamps on things like SBRs, and somewhat less prohibitively, but still intended to be prohibitive at the time, bans on things like suppressors and sawed-off shotguns, among other things. And so in the case of Miller, the law, which unfortunately, as a side effect, makes criminal out of otherwise law-abiding citizens, but the police said, we just won't go after those people with these laws, at least right now, was actually working as planned. And they caught these gangsters, and Miller ended up being murdered by other gangsters before the trial actually took place, which is why there was no plaintiff. And what the Supreme Court decided in that case, in United States versus Miller, was that the sawed-off shotgun ban, in fact, was constitutional because the militia clause of the Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, clearly established that the rights of arms to be preserved referred to the sort of arms that would be used in a military conflict. And at the time, no soldier on a battlefield used sawed-off double-barrel shotguns. That's just not a military-style weapon, which is a very interesting precedent and thing to think about in the context of modern debates about, what sorts of firearms should be protected or should be banned. But that's another Supreme Court case, which we'll get to in a second. So in the end, the ban on double-barrel sawed-off shotguns and other similar weapons not suitable for use in a militia was upheld. And that was the interpretation that stood. The other thing it established was that or at least it didn't establish it very clearly, but sort of maintained, was that the person whose right was being protected was the right of the militia, which in this case was the right of the independent states, not the national government, but the states who would organize and arm and equip and train, in theory, the militia, the state being not the national government. And that more or less remained precedent for the next 70 or so years until 2008, where we get our next big case, and that is Washington, D.C. versus Heller, or maybe it's Heller versus D.C. I don't remember the order there. But at the time, by this between Miller through to the early 2000s, Congress passed more and more bills restricting gun ownership rules, and not just Congress, but also local states and cities and so forth. And it was getting more restricted. We had a full-on assault weapons ban, which was sort of ambiguous in the 90s. It eventually lapsed more recently, but it was in place for some time. And there essentially wasn't really a law restricting firearm use that wasn't batted down until 2008 with Heller. In Washington, D.C., firearms had been essentially banned, handguns, I should say, had been essentially banned. They were permitted for on-duty law enforcement officers, and I believe security guards too, but those law enforcement officers and security guards who were allowed to carry these weapons weren't even allowed to possess them in their own homes. And so Heller, along with 5 other people who were later disqualified because they didn't own a gun, eventually sued for his right to own a pistol in his own home for personal defense. And this made it all the way to the Supreme Court. And in this ruling, this now quite infamous or famous ruling, depending on your view, the Supreme Court did a very interesting thing. They did a fairly in-depth, and by the court I really mean Justice Scalia, did a fairly in-depth historical analysis of the interpretation of these terms and clauses. He actually read primary source texts in the 1700s, 1800s, was trying to really get down to what were these strange technical phrases and so forth actually meant to mean. What did they mean in public use at the time? As a sort of tangent, this is also the point at which original intent fell out of favor among lawyers, and popular use sort of came in to fill its place. We can't read minds, but we can read original source texts and see how these things were used in context. A digression. It's a good thing to know if you ever do philological research or historical research on things like this. And what Scalia decided, or what Scalia concluded from his analysis, was that a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, was what he called a justificatory clause. It was a kind of introduction or a preamble, a miniature preamble to this right. And the right being established, it was actually a separate clause. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. But it's that third section, that third clause separated by commas. The right of the people to keep and bear arms. What it did was it established, in his view, in fairly clear language, whom the right was for, which is to say, the people, not the state, not the militia. And so understood in this way, the person whose right was being protected are the individuals. It was clear that Heller, which was working on this Miller interpretation at the time, in fact was violating both Heller's Second Amendment rights and everyone else in DC's. Since Heller, gun rights for individuals in the United States have expanded dramatically and indeed seem to be on a path of continued expansion. And we see this in the case of McDonald versus Chicago, which was, I want to say, 2012. Let me double check that really quickly. 2010. So not very long after at all. 2 years after Heller. And what all McDonald did was basically took the decision that was made in the federal jurisdiction, which is Washington, D.C., and said, look, under the Equal Protections Clause of the 14th Amendment, where everyone in the jurisdiction of the federal government is owed protection of their rights guaranteed to them in the Bill of Rights equally, then that means the Second Amendment and the First Amendment and all the other amendments enumerated in the Bill of Rights apply to everyone, even in independent states. And that brings us more or less to the present day. There are a lot of cultural arguments that people make. McDonald was kind of an interesting sort of dunk for conservatives because McDonald was a black man fighting for gun rights in Chicago. So it's very, very good optics. But I think for most people to understand this issue very clearly, the cultural, emotive arguments people will make are often very don't actually add a lot to the understanding of the principles. They can be very distracting, and they can get people thinking with their hearts rather than thinking with their brains. Not that you shouldn't have a heart, but it's very easy to be misled and pulled in directions you don't understand by your heart, much more so than your brain. So, when you hear people talk about, the early gun law restrictions were to prevent black slave uprisings, which is something conservatives say and happens to be true, the truth of the claim doesn't really add very much, in my opinion, to the argument, just as a lot of the emotional arguments that the left makes about, dead children and so forth. Never mind all the countries around the world that have, virtually no guns and still lots of dead children, or the countries that have lots of guns like Switzerland and very, very few murders. There are other issues at play there, and the statistics actually are very, very hard to work through with this. It is very much not clear that either side has a strong case to make by way of death statistics, for or against gun control. And it's made worse by the misleading tactics. In fact, I think it might be worth bringing up one such case. There was a case, just as an example of the things you have to be aware of in this case. I'll just read from, it was actually the first blog I ever wrote on caffeine and philosophy, on data and science. It comes from one of my favorite YouTubers, the Justicar, who I don't think he makes content anymore, but he was excellent at the time. He exposed a fraudulent study published in the Journal of American Medical Associates linking Australia's 1996 gun restriction legislation to decreases in mass shootings, in which mass shootings are bizarrely and uniquely defined as having 5 or more fatalities, rather than the usual 4 or more used by the FBI and virtually every other serious organization studying the issue. This allows the study authors to tap in a triumphal 0 in the 1997 to 2013 mass shootings list, and lends credibility to the juxtaposed 1979 to 1996 firearm homicide mean of 0.56 per 100,000, and the 1996 to 2013 firearm homicide mean of 0.2 per 100,000. So off the bat, the minute scale of the increased safety achieved should be noted, even if the data is taken at face value. This is like banning vending machines in order to save the 13 people killed per year in the United States. But at some point, even convenience is worth a few lives on scale. How much more important are vending machines than firearms? Probably not very, and I don't think anyone would be willing to ban cars to save the dramatically higher rate of fatalities that they achieve. For mere convenience, not even for really any principle of civic duty or defense or so forth. They're not merely a hobby. Guns are not. They're a source of personal protection, a provider of food, and are in any case enshrined in our Constitution. But anyways, but that's not really the point. The point is that the data shouldn't be taken at face value. And if you break down the homicide data rate a little more closely, you end up with this. Between 1979 and 1981, you had 0.65 deaths per 100,000 by firearm homicide. 82 to 84, 0.68. 85 to 87, 0.68. 88 to 90, 0.46. 91 to 93, 0.47. 94 to 96, 0.44. 97 to 99, 0.32. 2000 to 2002, 0.27. 2003 to 2005, 0.14. 06 to 08, 0.16. 09 to 11, 0.16. And 12 to 13, 0.17. So there was a downward trend prior to the enacted legislation. And it looks as if the chosen metric for what qualifies as a mass shooting was what is called in logical circles a Texas sharpshooter fallacy. You choose the metric based on the data existing in order to make your preferred conclusion look more substantiated. I think in modern statistics this is usually done by p-hacking, but that's a digression. So anyways, you have to be careful with statistics and how these statistical analyses are done. But that's a sort of a digression within a digression. So I've said that I want to offer the argument for both sides. And being a strong person on the pro gun ownership side, I want to try my hand at making an argument for gun restrictions, or at least for the right of states to restrict guns more. a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of the free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. We saw in Heller that the people is defined as individuals. This is pretty intuitive. But was that what the founders meant? I don't think it's clear that it was. If we go back to the 1750s, I'm going to do this by memory, so I'm going to probably get some dates and some phrases wrong, but bear with me. Ben Franklin wrote a letter on behalf of the Pennsylvania General Assembly, which has been quite frequently quoted these days. Everyone knows the famous line of, those who would give up a bit of liberty to purchase a little bit of safety will deserve and get neither. I'm sure I'm misquoting the actual phrasing of it, but that's the gist of it. And people interpret that as we should take a little bit of risky liberty over the safety that we can achieve if we give up what we think we can achieve if we give up liberty. And that would be my personal tendency and leaning. But it's not clear that that's actually what was meant. And if we look at the context in which Ben Franklin was writing this letter on behalf of the Pennsylvania General Assembly, what was happening was Pennsylvania was more or less at war with the Native Americans in the region, and they needed to raise money for this conflict. And so one of the things that they were proposing to do was to raise a land levy, a land tax, in order to raise money for the war effort to keep their towns safe. But they had a barrier, and the barrier to passing this land tax was the Penn family itself. The Penn family did not even live in Pennsylvania at the time, or at least William Penn or whoever the heir of the original Penn founder didn't live in Pennsylvania at the time. He lived in like Virginia or somewhere south. And to whom this letter was addressed. They had been opposing all forms of land taxes because their land was quite expansive in that area and they didn't want to be taxed on it. So there was an unspoken agreement throughout most of the 1740s and 1750s that they would not try to tax the Penn's land, and in exchange the town, the Pennsylvania Assembly would be more or less granted the right to govern itself as it saw fit. And so by opposing this, the Penn family was opposing the liberty of the represented Pennsylvania constituents, the people, to govern themselves, which included the ability to pass land taxes. The safety being purchased was the safety from these taxes. So for most libertarians, this will be a little bit disheartening. It seems to imply that what Ben Franklin meant is almost exactly the opposite of how the line is usually interpreted today. Those who would give up the right of a representative people to pass the necessary bills and legislation and law to keep society functioning, for the sake of safety, and by that we mean safety from the inconveniences that these laws might cause to individuals, will get and deserve neither. They'll get neither a well-functioning society, nor will they get, freedom from the impositions of government anyways. Not quite a modern interpretation, which maybe brings us back to the importance of doing what Scalia did in going back and fill with the monocle of a philologist, closely reading through these original documents to understand, the common use and perhaps even the original defense, because the original intent, because we're not lawyers here, we're mere, amateur philosophers and patriots, right? So if the right of the people referred to in the Second Amendment refers to the right of the people in a kind of collective sense at the level of the state. Keep and bear arms does in fact seem to point towards something like a militia. Now, of course, something Scalia also noted in Heller was that militia as meant at the time referred to the entire population of white men between the ages of between the ages of 18 and 45. A modern expert and scholar on this, Eugene Volokh, is very quick to add, this would obviously include people of different racial backgrounds and religions, and even women in modern times. But the sense is, it's the standing body of potential soldiers should the need arise to go to war. That's the militia. And so a well-regulated militia, being like a well-trained and well-equipped militia, it sort of implies in Scalia's view that the right of the people to keep and bear arms is a right to be ready, because you can't necessarily trust the state. However, it has been noted by historians that it was considered the not just the duty, but the exclusive right of the state to arm these militias, which would imply that it is perhaps not the right of the people to arm themselves, at least not necessarily. And given the the importance of being able to control what sorts of dangerous equipment comes into and out of your state, whether that's for economic reasons or for safety reasons, never mind whether or not it's effective. Perhaps it does seem to be in the individual states' rights to limit firearm ownership. Now, for my steelman argument here, my setting up the strong case for gun restriction, I don't think it's enough to make a legal case. You have to also make a moral case. Why is it right to do this? And I think we all have this ideal of liberty that we're pursuing, right? But each of our ideals as Americans of liberty, it looks a little different from each other. My ideal of liberty is a little different than your ideal of liberty. What liberty actually means in practice looks different. The duty of a legitimate government is to provide for the common interest. What you do in your liberty is, sort of your business. But what affects everyone in a more or less universal way sort of becomes the jurisdiction of the legitimate state. And so it's where safety is concerned. Safety is a universal thing. Safety is an objective matter. It affects everyone in more or less the same way, in a much different way than liberty does. And so, while it is important for the state to preserve liberty, the Constitution explicitly states that it is the purpose of the government to provide for the safety of its people as well. And so, one could take a strong constitutional case for restricting the right, particularly of dangerous individuals, of mentally unwell individuals, of felons, which was not really an issue in past times. Felons were just executed. Whether or not they could own a firearm was quickly irrelevant. And to prevent domestic unrest and the like. And one could even go so far as to make an argument that just the concern alone is worth taking seriously. That doesn't mean it's a winner off the bat, but that it's worth taking seriously. And I think these are all potentially strong arguments to make. But now let me go back, take my steelman hat, my opposition argument hat off, and take my own side again. I think the most important thing to get at when looking at the Second Amendment and the source of confusion surrounding it is the question of its purpose. What is the purpose of the Second Amendment? Is it for personal protection? Is it for sport and hunting? Is it for defense against a tyrannical government? Or is it for defense against perhaps a foreign government, as implied by a militia clause, perhaps? If we go back to the origins of the Second Amendment, the tradition that existed prior to the Second Amendment, which permitted it to be passed into the Bill of Rights so quickly, with almost no debate whatsoever among the Founding Fathers, it's because it came from the Rights of Englishmen, which did not extend to Catholics, but it did grant the right of arms arms ownership to Protestants in England. And this came from the yeoman tradition back in the day. In the Middle Ages, England's military power was, prior to the greatness of its navy in the 1600s, 1700s, was its longbowmen. It had a tremendous foundation of archery in its culture, with these extraordinarily well-trained and well-practiced soldiers who could shoot arrows 200, 300, 400 yards maybe, en masse, and just wipe out an entire French cavalry charge in a wide range of quite famous battles. In a time where many other European countries prohibited the peasants, the people underneath the class of the knights, to own weapons, England had encouraged it. It didn't have the manpower or the wealth that many of its European competitors had, and so it not just permitted the petty landowner class, the yeomen, to own weapons, but it in fact banned all sports except archery on Sundays. It basically it said, not only are you allowed to have a weapon, you have to have a weapon and you have to know how to use it. And this gave Britain a huge military advantage, but it did something else too. It gave the British petty landowner class a sense of skin in the game, a sense of ownership earned on the battlefield for their own country, a sense of England not being the country I live in, who belongs to, the Lord over there and his knights, but in some sense, my land. In some sense, my country. And I think that's an important part in any republic with a democratic element, is for the democratically active citizens to have that sense of ownership. This is, of course, the traditional origin of where the Second Amendment comes from, and we can see it's sort of on the converse side of that, very similar language to the Bill of the Second Amendment. The right to keep and bear arms used in the negative where the Scottish Highlanders were concerned. This is the language used to disarm the Scots in the aftermath of Culloden and the Jacobite Rebellion at around the time of the American Revolution as well, interestingly enough. So, is the Second Amendment about a state militia, as argued in Miller? Or is it about the individual right to self-defense, as argued in Heller? Or is it about the defense against tyranny, which is taken by some? Or is it just a right to do as you please with fun toys, as some libertarians like to sort of go that route? I think there's a stronger, and the problem with each of these cases, there's a sense of exclusivity. If it's one, it's not the other, and it feels unreasonable to demand that the government can have no impositions on any of these things. Like, as cool as it would be, and I'm sympathetic to the libertarians on this, as cool as it would be to own your own Apache helicopter, there is something reasonable about the government saying, no, private citizens are not allowed to own Apache helicopters. There is something reasonable about that. But insofar as the state needs to function and protect people, we ban things that are fun all the time. It's really fun to drive a car 180 miles an hour on the road, but that's not permitted. Even though it's convenient, it's not just fun; it actually gets you places faster. But there are ways to uphold the purpose of these rights that are enumerated, without completely emasculating the government's ability to do its job, which the Founding Fathers clearly believed that it had a job, at least at the state level. So what is the purpose of the Second Amendment? We're often told that, none of these rights are absolute. But when it's said that way, it feels like that's just an excuse to ignore the right and to find, whatever exception would be convenient and just apply it as if the right didn't exist at all. We hear this especially when it comes to hate speech in the First Amendment, a conversation for another time. I think these rights are not absolute is an extremely unhelpful and perhaps even inaccurate statement, because what is a right if it has whatever exceptions we want whenever we want them? I think the more important thing to say is that when we look at the people who initially passed these rights in the 1780s and the laws that they passed immediately afterwards, we can get a sense of what was actually meant by these rights. I am of the opinion that the Founding Fathers had something like all of these purposes in mind. Self-defense is already protected under common law, as gun restriction proponents love to bring up. But the right to keep and bear arms is pretty functionally important in being able to defend yourself, which they don't like to admit. The right to do as you please without undue, sanction and inconvenience and prohibition from the government is also an important thing, a sort of default, default permission rather than a default prescription, and I think that's important too. The right to stand up to a tyrannical government is in some way the most important and also most ridiculous of the interpretations. Because, of course, if you're going to overthrow your government, you don't need the government's permission to do that. Which, of course, isn't the idea of the Second Amendment. They're trying to give you the tools necessary, to say it. But at the same time, it is also important for the government to be able to put down rebellions and uprisings. And I mean, every libertarian who might, whose hackles might go up when they hear that, just think about your frustration. I'm assuming you feel it. When Antifa was permitted and Black Lives Matter were permitted to burn our cities for a full year with little to no resistance. Imagine that. Think about the failure of government precisely for not putting down what was in reality not an insurrection, but a kind of fourth generation attack on the whole cultural infrastructure and in some ways economic infrastructure of our country. It is important for the government to be able to do that. And so how are we supposed to know the difference? It's supposed to provide the tools for this, but also maintain the right to put down rebellions. It's supposed to give us the right to protect ourselves, but not in some incredible, you get your own Apache helicopter kind of way. It permits us to have fun, but not too much fun. What is the unifying factor of all of these things? I think the real purpose of the Second Amendment is more fundamental than all of these things. I am reading into the text, I'm interpolating into the text. This is not a legal opinion, this is a philosophical opinion, so take it as you will. But I think the purpose of the Second Amendment is dignity. This might take a little bit of unpacking. Dignity is what replaced honor when law first entered history. If you read something like Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes' History of the Common Law, he cites what is fairly unanimous opinion among scholars that the origins of Western law came out of the desire to put an end to blood feuds. Whether this is in Germania, whether this is in Greece, the origins of law are from the people came together to try to put an end to blood feuds and the cycles of violence that dominated pre-civilization, pre-legal society. This is the Hatfields and McCoys, this is the Montagues and Capulets, and we hear a particularly horrific story of such a blood feud within a family in the Greek origin story of dignity, and that is in Aeschylus's Eumenides. There's apologies for this going on so long, but I think it's important. Instead of, in a world of honor, anytime someone insults you, your honor, which is your value in society, comes under threat, and so you have to go and fight. You have to punch back. You have to hit back. Dignity, and I'll have to explain this in a longer podcast at some point about modernism, but the basic idea of dignity, which you can get from Tamler Sumner's excellent book, Why Honor Matters, is the idea that your value and your worth is actually intrinsic. It doesn't come. You don't have to prove it. You don't have to earn it. Your value as a human individual exists independently of all that and intrinsically. Now, it is an open question whether this thing called dignity actually exists or not. It feels, in some ways, like a legal construct, but I'm not sure that law or civilization could work without it either. So I'll let you sort that out. But so long as we're working within the framework of law and trying to maintain civilization, dignity is the bedrock. Dignity is the foundation from which all of the rest of this becomes possible. And so from that assumption, we work out towards the democratic republic that we have today. Dignity, it includes, among other things, the idea that we can consent. There's a basic respect in dignity that says, yes, this person has free will. They have the ability to make choices and are responsible for their choices as a matter of respect. And the assumption of innocence, which is not just a legal thing, but a matter of basic respect that we offer to each other, also comes into play. The problem with restricting guns is that it presumes guilt, or rather, it treats people as helpless, consequences of their environment. They just act out how they're programmed, and it takes away the possibility of consent at the civic level, and it defeats the entire purpose, we could say, of democracy. I mean, if people can just be led around and manipulated and can't be trusted to own guns by default and can't be trusted to speak without being, their speech being checked out to make sure it's not disinformation first, which is a form of prior restraint, violating the spirit of the First Amendment, even if it's not coming from Congress per se. What that signals is a loss of dignity. It signals a retraction of the necessary respect extended by default to citizens in order for a functioning democracy to work. It's become very popular these days to take a kind of technocratic manager approach, to look at human beings in terms of cause and effect and A/B testing, and from a kind of marketer's framework. If we put out, this message, then 22% of people will have this response and so forth. And if we permit people to have guns, then, there will be 7.3 more murders per capita per year, whatever, in this city. And it treats people as cogs in a machine. And it governs them as if they were cogs in a machine. That undermines the entire purpose and nature, not just of the Constitution, but the underlying assumptions about humans that permits civilization to work. You have to have a basic assumption of innocence and assumption of responsibility. And rights are just an emergent byproduct of that. Without that, tyranny becomes inevitable, not as a matter of sort of a tragic inevitability, but as the desired goal. Because the more control over the variables in your system you can get, the better your outcomes will be. Who's deciding what those desirable outcomes are? Well, of course, the managers in charge. So insofar as the Second Amendment is about respecting the dignity of citizens, what it does is it entrusts citizens with the power to have fun, to protect themselves, to protect their state and their government from foreign invaders, or to protect the spirit of their state from their own government, not as a matter of do this or don't do this, but empowering them to use their own wisdom and decision-making and choices to do what is right. And people will screw up, and they do screw up. But obviously. And it's very popular now to point to mass shooters and so forth. But we just passed a few days ago the, if memory serves, the anniversary of the Waco massacre, April 19th. I'm sorry. So not terribly recently, where, for those of you who don't know, the United States government, in its wisdom, in pursuing slightly illegal firearms, of all things, ended up gassing to death 37 women and children. I'm sorry, it might have been more. Am I remembering that correctly? 46 children, 91 Branch Davidians. So almost 100 people, including almost 50 children, gassed to death. So, and of course the same people who want to ban guns are also going on and on about police brutality and so forth. So it's not the sort of situation where you get to pick the best of both worlds. Everything's a matter of trade-offs. I think what it comes down to is, do you want to lean in to the technocratic manager direction, where if we can just restrict guns in the right systematic fashion, if we just remove the possibility of committing crimes with these things, and in doing so also remove the possibility of the correct and proper use of these tools, then we can, move closer to some kind of utopia or whatnot. Or do we lean in the direction that undergirds and has undergirded our republic since its inception? The concept of dignity that we see emerge in the form of rights and natural law, the assumption of innocence, and that crimes are to be punished. All prior restraint is, which is what's alluded to when the First Amendment talks about the freedom of speech, is the saying it's okay for the government to punish speech, but they can't stop you from saying it in the first place or for publishing it in print. They can only punish you after the fact, which I think is very equivalent to saying they can't stop you from buying a gun. They can only punish you if you misuse it, if you use it in a criminal fashion. I think that's the more consistent view with the spirit of the Constitution, with the spirit of dignity, and the spirit of, for lack of a better phrase, America. So that's my take. I think it's certainly a controversial one. It's not one you'll find to hear, the right of the people, or the allusion to the free state as an allusion to the individual in a kind of Platonic republic kind of sense. The free state is a state of dignity. But I think it's consistent with the spirit of America, with the spirit of the rights of Englishmen, and from the Roman and Greek tradition of dignity that it descends from. It's consistent with the Western tradition of dignity, and is an essential and crucial right of people with dignity. So I think I'll close it with there. I think I've gone on long enough. Good night, everyone, and have a good evening.